Hello, Heathens. Welcome back. Today I have the one and only Dr. Jemar Tisby. Welcome. Hello.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for shooting your shot on Twitter, which is it's not I'm not that big a deal, but it was fun to see you reach out on social media and know that some good can come of it.
Absolutely. No, I think I said something along the lines of like I would sell my left arm. Um, I really like my left arm. I am right-handed, but left arm's still important.
Still
I've been
want that balance.
Yeah, exactly. Like, pinky toe small, but will really mess you up if you don't have it. I've been a fan of your work for a while now. Um, as many of my sort of followers, audience know, when I was in undergrad, I ended up writing my thesis. I was an economics major, but I ended up writing my thesis on the statistical correlation between early childhood education and incarceration later in life. And it
Mm,
was a super depressing paper,
yeah, yeah.
but it sparked an interest in me in these social issues, which I'm really kind of ashamed to say that I was aware of, but I wasn't very involved in prior to this because I grew up in a very white, very evangelical household. Where if we didn't have like none of us have bad feelings about this black person that goes to church with
Right.
us, so like racism doesn't exist. We don't see color. Even though like I would tell you my dad probably has some racist tendencies, right? Hey dad. So like it was interesting writing this paper. I picked up Brian Stevenson's book Just Mercy, and it changed my life.
Mm.
And so I picked that book up, and I have just continued picking books like that up since. And this, I guess I should tell people, sorry, Dr. Tisby wrote this book, The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity and racism. And for anyone that's listened to me for more than 5 minutes, this is like my bag. Um, but I'm going to stop talking now. So thanks again for being here. I would love it if you would tell people a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you to writing this book, other than it's just very true.
Sure. Well, I've spent the past almost 20 years in the Deep South, specifically in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas
That'll do it.
side, what one author called the most southern place on earth. And it's so true in so many ways. I got there through Teach for America. I joined the Corps after college and became a sixth grade teacher. That was my first career. And they placed me here in the Delta in Phillips County, which was listed a couple of years ago as the fourth poorest county in the nation. Whenever I tell people about this place, it's like I'm talking to them about like Saturn or Neptune or something. It seems like another planet. And a lot of people don't think a place like this with such concentrated generational poverty can exist in the United States, the wealthiest nation. But it does. And that's a direct legacy of race-based chattel slavery and then convict leasing and then patterns of disinvestment. So, the poverty rate generally is around 11%. In my town, it's 40%. The town is 75% black, has been losing population for the past 50 years. And every census, it just gets smaller and smaller because there's just not much to keep people here in terms of education or industry or whatever. So all of that. And it took on a much more personal face because of the students who are walking into my class every day. They're dealing with issues of homelessness and food insecurity and lack of health care and educational options and all of that. So I'm asking, what does my faith have to do with these real material issues of justice? And I became a Christian in these white evangelical spaces that you referenced. I was that black guy, and I didn't know anything about Christianity. So this introduction was all I thought it was. And the reality was that these issues of material justice didn't come up very often in those circles. So eventually, I became a teacher for 4 years. I was a principal for another few years. And then I went to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. And that was an education within an education. And then
I can imagine.
I didn't know what I was getting into, but I got through it, thankfully, with strong community and faith. And then after that is when I started my PhD in history at the University of Mississippi, studying religion and social movements. And it was during that phase in graduate school when I was reading literally hundreds of books on history that I decided to write The Color of Compromise.
Thank you. I just want to say before we sort of get into the content that I really appreciated how accessible this book is. I read a lot of books, and there is something to be said for folks who can take really high level information, synthesize it, and understand it and communicate it so clearly that a person that has never really thought about it, this issue, for instance, or this history, can pick it up, one, be engaged, and two, clearly understand what's going on and how we've sort of gotten here. So well done.
Yeah.
Not that you
Wow,
needed
I
my
appreciate that.
like
No, I do.
validation.
I need it. I receive it, and it's helpful.
If you don't mind me asking, did you grow up in the church, or did you become a Christian sort of later in life?
So I didn't grow up in the church, but I became a Christian in high school. So now more than half my life I've been in the church or in the faith. But yeah, we weren't hostile to the faith at all. It just wasn't a priority in my family. And it was, my conversion was like a classic event, friendship conversion, friendship evangelism story. Someone befriended me, invited me to youth group, and that began the process where I prayed the sinner's prayer and all of that stuff.
Yeah. God, that brings back memories. I'm going to go down that path. Something that I think a lot of people don't maybe know is that race, as we understand it today, is a socially constructed thing that was not always this way. And I was hoping, since you wrote about it in the book, that you might speak a little bit to that for folks that think it's just always been this way.
That is a really important point to understand historically, and also socially, because if it hasn't always been this way, then there's a possibility that it doesn't have to be this way going forward. So race is socially constructed, by which we mean it's not based in any sort of biological or ontological fact of reality, right? Like skin color is literally the amount of melanin in one's skin. The Human Genome Project, which mapped the DNA of human beings, said we are 99.9% similar. So, I mean, we are way, 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 way more alike biologically than different. Right. But even sort of theologically speaking, I'm always coming back to the doctrine of the image of God in Genesis chapter 1, saying that we're all made in God's image, right? So race is created, and it really has a history dating back to the late 15th century on into the 16th. It has a lot to do with European imperialism and global expansion to extract resources and exploit labor across the globe. And so when Europeans, beginning with the Portuguese and Spain, but France and England and the Dutch, when they came to North and Central and South America as we know it now, had to come up with some reason to take the land from indigenous inhabitants. The Pope and the Catholic Church had a lot to do with giving sort of a divine sanction for that. And then B, they had to come up with some sort of rationale for why darker skinned people, namely people of African descent, were meant to be laborers for life, and would never get paid or wages for that. And that's where this idea of race arises, but it hasn't always been the case. Much more salient prior to this, 15th century period was ideas of ethnicity, which was an elastic term that could include your language, your nation, your tribe, certain physical characteristics, but nothing like what we see in race-based chattel slavery, where your lineage and your skin color actually gave permission for you to be enslaved.
Right. Something that I found really interesting reading this book that I wasn't aware of before, sort of was a lot of things, but this one particular sort of twofold. One was reading about this doctrine of spirituality, which has permeated, as far as I can tell, every aspect of Christianity that I've personally been a part of. And also, when the Great Awakening took place, and we see enslaved people starting to become Christians because they've suddenly decided, not the enslaved people, but the white folks have suddenly decided that they actually can evangelize to these people, and they probably should. But a problem here is that when you baptize another Christian, or when you baptize someone, they become a Christian, and a lot of folks had this idea that you shouldn't be enslaving other Christians. And if we baptize someone, now this person becomes free. And the way that our economy is set up, it's not really gonna work. And so you see this, and obviously you know this, but this shift in theology where they decide, free is it can mean a lot of things. So you'll be spiritually liberated, but physically your body will still be bound. We still own you. You're still going to work for us. We might be equal in Christ, but we don't actually believe in inequality here. And now that I've told that entire story, I was wondering if you would speak a little bit more about the doctrine of spirituality, because I feel like it's at work there, as well as how theology over time has been the product of external factors, especially as it relates to capitalism.
Yeah.
You don't have to speak directly on the capitalism part.
Well, if we're going to speak of race and racism and white supremacy, one part of the conversation that's often lacking in Christian circles is the talk of capitalism. Because again, like I referenced, race came about in large part as a justification for exploitative labor practices and imperialism, which had everything to do with money. So we can never, extricate that completely from the conversation. As to the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, one practical point here is this is why it's so critical to excavate the history of one's denomination, tradition, congregation, and actually proactively put it out there. I'm talking about on the website, in books, in the literature about your institution or your church or whatever it might be. You put this in your new members class and your Sunday school courses so people know. Why do I say that? Because a lot of my history, like when I was in seminary, was with the Presbyterian Church of America, which is the far conservative side of Presbyterianism that's also connected to Southern Presbyterianism, which broke off from the larger body during the Civil War in order to preserve and protect slavery. So it was a pro-slavery denomination, pro-slavery roots, very Southern-based. I didn't know any of this. All I knew was the people I interacted with. I knew the church polity or the church governance, and I'm like, okay, I want to explore this. And then as I explored, I come to find out things like the doctrine of the spirituality of the church. And it felt like a blindside, especially as a Black person, to be like, why am I here when the roots and the people you're holding up, that my professors would hold up, that pastors held up, that church leaders held up as like examples of the faith, they would have enslaved me. Like, how does that work? And I wish I would have known sooner. So I had to find out on my own. And the doctrine of the spirituality of the church is a theology that says the church's role is ministerial and declarative. that it is to act as the conscience of the government and society, but it's not to intermeddle in political affairs or worldly affairs. Now, there's something to that, right? We're talking about the separation of church and state, you know, all of that stuff, but that's not really how they deployed it. That's not really how they applied it. They were perfectly fine.
It seems to be applied very specifically.
Exactly. It's extremely selectively applied. And typically, this was a doctrine that Presbyterians in particular called the spirituality of the church, but there was some form of it in most white denominations. And what happened in application was they're perfectly willing to get involved in worldly matters. But when it came to race and racism and issues of the day, whether that was slavery or segregation, you throw up your hands and say, oh, spirituality of the church, that is a worldly, earthly, political matter. You're talking about race here. We can't get involved. We're just the church. Our role is spiritual. Well, isn't that convenient? So now you can skirt around what is typically one of the biggest and most important and urgent social issues of the day and just say, well, we're being faithful.
It's like when people, I'm trying to remember who I was speaking to about this. And if you're listening, forgive me. Oh, I think it was Pastor Trey Ferguson. And he was saying that he absolutely loathes the term biblical, like a biblical worldview, because it's always used to support whatever is convenient for the person deploying it. And it's so I don't want to if you're reading 66 books in the Bible and you think that there's one biblical worldview, it seems, I don't know, iffy at best. Now, I am not I'm not religious, so I don't want to speak to anyone's personal religion. I just think it's convenient, as you said, that this biblical worldview that's often put out there is just whatever that person actually wants to protect their own status or power or whatever it is of theirs that they want to maintain. And then they're like, it's just biblical. Is it though?
There was a writer who said the opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. This idea that you got it all figured out. I recently wrote an article on my Substack newsletter that said it was called "The People Who Don't Have Any Questions." And that is a phrase that a friend of mine used in describe white evangelicals and sort of right-wing Christianity. And by that he meant, and I knew exactly what he meant the moment he said it, by that he meant they thought they had it all figured out. There was an answer to every single question. Every issue had one response, one quote unquote biblical response. There was one party to vote for, one stance on, right to life or pro-life issues, as they would call it, one stance on race and justice. And they knew the answer to everything. And why do you need faith when you already know everything? Why do you need faith when you're already certain about everything? So that is often described the kind of theology that leads to pro-slavery and pro-segregation Christianity.
Right. Excuse me. I was talking to Dr. Julie Ingersoll the other day about the Christian Reconstructionist movement and what it has its roots in. And it's something that you also you write about in your book. I think, when we go to school in America, of course, we learn about the Civil War and we sort of learn, it happened because they were fighting over slaves or like over the ability to own slaves. And I think sometimes it becomes it's something we've heard so often as at least white Americans, like that it becomes almost banal. And I think people don't think about it enough. And it's something I appreciated about this chapter because it drives home the fact that many, many, many people were willing to fight and die over their rights to own another human being. And I think people need to let that set in and not just gloss over it like we tend to do in history classes, because if you are willing to fight and die for something, it is something you really value. there is not, can't think of much in this world that I'm going to go fight and die for. Like maybe my
Right.
family, maybe,
Right.
if they're like on a good day. But certainly not something like my job, right? Like, or anything like that. And so I think we really need to spend some time and get real uncomfortable with the fact that so many of these people were Christians, and they
Yes.
were parts of churches, and their value system was so steeped in this that they were willing to give up their lives for it. And if
Right.
you don't think that that will come through in their theology, in their practices, and it will continue throughout time until there's a reckoning.
That's right.
Because you don't always, or we don't always, if we don't know our history, we don't see the way these things have permeated and sort of evolved. Anyway, I digress. But what I think I would love for you to talk about a little bit is sort of the theology that came out of the Civil War. Because I know we have people like, I believe it was Dabney, who greatly influences Rushdoony later on, and Rushdoony who then goes on to greatly influence politics, unfortunately, and even things like the young earth creationist movement. Like, it's wild, all of the things.
Yep.
So I was hoping you could speak a little bit about that, because I think that's really important to understand those roots.
It goes back to the conversation we were having about certainty, that and what is considered biblical in order to. So I like to think that theology leads and informs our actions. And in a lot of cases, our actions, our culture, our lifestyle informs our theology. In other words, we're coming up with theological justifications and rationale for the behavior that we're already doing or that we want to do. And so, theology tends to follow our behavior and our culture rather than lead it. And that's what's definitely happening with, say, pro-slavery theology in the Civil War. What happened was, this is connected to a contemporary issue of white Christian nationalism. White Christian nationalism, Sam Perry and Philip Gorski, two sociologists who wrote The Flag and the Cross, they describe white Christian nationalism as a deep story, as a narrative, and who are the characters and what is the plot. The main characters are white Christians, mostly men, who founded this nation as an explicitly Christian nation. The nation prospered to the extent that it followed these Christian principles. And if it is off track, which they believe it is, then it is due to the others, the antagonists in this narrative, which are almost always people of color. Women today would be queer people and more, who don't fit this norm of the main character. That narrative was at play during the Civil War and really throughout U.S. history in one form or another. It took on the form in that era of the Lost Cause, which is subsequent to the Civil War, to try to explain how the South lost militarily and try to say that their cause was righteous ultimately. But leading up to and during the Civil War, they're basically saying this is a white man's country. And what these northern white liberals are talking about and what these black people are talking about is taking America away from its Christian roots, away from the established social order and hierarchy. And that's what people were fighting for. So it was really a rich man's war. Plantation owners, the wealthy class of people who sent poor people off to fight. But why did the poor people fight? Because they had a sense that their way of life, their social order, and even the possibility as poor white people for social advancement was under attack if they emancipated enslaved people. So they were fighting for what they believed was a righteous cause in their way of life. Then they come behind and say, well, actually, it's in the Bible. There's this thing called the curse of Ham that permanently sentences people of African descent to slavery. There's all these household codes in Ephesians that say, here's the order of things, with the pinnacle and the top of the pyramid, the white male patriarch who is benevolently taking care of the spouse and the children and even enslaved people as an extended part of the household, who, by the way, were perpetual children who always needed stewardship. So it's a whole theology that flows out of that view of the nation, Christianity, and hierarchy.
I think I was listening to Brad Onishi's podcast, and when he had you on, talking about how even the idea of the nuclear family in a lot of ways stems from this patriarchal sort of plantation hierarchy. And I thought it was really interesting for a lot of reasons. One, because I think the nuclear family I think it harms a lot of people today because nothing against that, but like we live in very isolated groups now. And I think if you're trying to raise a family, this doesn't mean that you have to be like polyamorous or something, but like we're not even living with, like, you don't have your grandparents around, you don't have parents around, mm-hmm. Everybody's like so spread out, but we're so entrenched in this idea that the nuclear family is the only right way. That we end up just, I think, driving a lot of parents kind of crazy. I don't know. I don't have any kids. That's part of the reason. But I think the more interesting part here was this idea that I think still exists today for so many white men in power, that it's their job to take care of all of us in one way or another, mm-hmm. right? Like, mm-hmm. and some of us more than others, right? Like, I'm a woman, so they're like, yeah, we got to take care of her, but I'm also white, so they're like, not as much probably. And by take care, they mean forced to conform into what they want and what they think is best. And so I thought that was a really important, interesting sort of through line for folks to see, that it's still playing out today, just in another iteration. But I did want to skip forward a little bit, because we've been talking a lot about sort of civil war and things in the distant, they're not that distant, but in the more distant past. But something that I would really like to touch on a little bit, and I don't want to give everything away in the book, but something that like I have been trying to scream at people for a while, because people seem to not really know about it or not know much about it, and that has impacted so much of what we see today. And it touches on what you were talking about at the top of the show, about where you were living and the poverty level and it being mm-hmm. predominantly Black. And that's redlining. Mm-hmm. So I would love if we could talk a little bit about what redlining was, and how it impacted communities and the impact that it still has today.
It's a fantastic an important point, because one of the things that we got to realize about racism is it's not just a matter of attitudes, it's a matter of assets, by which I mean physical, material assets, right? Like, the president of the college I work at, Simmons College, his name is Dr. Kevin Cosby. He makes a point in one of his books that the primary expression of racism today is not one person treating another person badly and calling them names, things like that we would typically think of. The primary expressions of racism today are material. It's the opportunities that Black people and other people of color get locked out of or have less of. It's even the favors that white people grant to other white people, but not to Black people or people of color. And one of the manifestations of that is with redlining and real estate, which is important, right? Because typically your home is your biggest asset. It's where you talk about wealth, which is assets minus your debts. Your house is going to be the biggest part of that equation. Absolutely. And right now, the racial wealth gap is white people have 10 times the wealth of Black people. And you can have a racist or an anti-racist explanation for that. The racist explanation is that, well, Black people aren't good with money. They're lazy. White people are more talented with money. They work harder, right? We're ascribing traits based on color.
White people are not more talented. Let me just say that. There's one thing I know to be true in this life. with anything. But
you
anyway,
know,
I
some
said
would
it.
argue the opposite, so we have to address it,
Full-time
unfortunately.
white
And
person here.
full
Definitely can attest.
It's good.
Unfortunately. Sorry.
um, or the anti-racist explanation is that it's there's something wrong with the system. So real estate and redlining is one very concrete and relevant example of what we would call systemic racism. Historically, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they were coming up with their own standards in real estate about how to assess property value, how to assess they were looking in particular at the safety of loans that they might give, and assessing whether somebody could pay it back, how much they could afford to give out in loans, et cetera. And what they came up with was this ranking system that used different colors, and red neighborhoods were neighborhoods that had really any people of color, but especially large percentages of people of color, and those were devalued. Now, it's a really salient point, because even though the legal manifestation of redlining has been outlawed and for a while now, but the legacy of that continues. And there's a report that, as we record this, it came out just yesterday. It was a first of its kind report, because they, for the first time, had access to 48 million home appraisal reports. Typically, they get the aggregate data. They had the actual reports for this study. And so they looked at communities that had over 500,000 people and had at least 50,000 people of color. And the results are sad but predictable, that white homes, even in a home appraisal, so we're talking places that have the exact same square footage, similar layouts, all of that stuff is the same. White homes consistently valued far and away higher above the homes of Black people and other people of color. And what's even worse, that discrepancy is increasing. So with COVID and with recessions and with different factors like that, the racial inequality in home appraisals is not only not going away, it's not only persisting, it's getting worse. And this is a direct legacy of redlining, where you're giving literal monetary value based on the racial composition of a neighborhood or even an individual home.
I think I was reading, if I'm remembering correctly, The Color of Law. I believe it's by Richard Rothstein.
Mm-hmm.
Phenomenal book, but we're not here to talk about that book. But I was reading about redlining, but also some of the other sort of insidious practices that went on when urbanization sort of took root, and we see more factories and more jobs being created, and so they need people to work in these factories. And like, okay, we're going to let Black people work in these factories, but they can't live in these certain areas. We're going to push them all out to sort of the more rural, is it not rural, but like unincorporated areas. And there had been housing built that was meant to be temporary after the war, or for the war, after the war, for the people that were working in these factories, if I'm remembering correctly. And they were built in two different ways. Some of them were built very temporarily or for temporary use, so they weren't particularly sturdy. Some were better built, more long-term. And I'm sure this will come as a surprise to absolutely no one. All of the temporarily poorly built housing that is more on the outskirts was what was going to be allotted to primarily Black workers or people of color. And then you have these homes that are much, much more long-term, and they're given to white families. And if I'm remembering correctly, and I might not be, this is just around the time of the New Deal. And we see FDR wanting to put some good stuff in place, but needing the support of Southern senators. And you talk about this a bit in your book, so I was hoping you could sort of speak with a little more eloquence than I have to these policies that FDR wanted to put in place, and then what he had to do to actually get this passed and the impact it had on communities of color.
This is all so depressingly racialized. So even the nomenclature that we use, right? So like the New Deal would have been called something like a social support system when it helped white people. But programs like that and on into the 60s and even to the present would be called welfare when it's helping Black people and other people of color, or even more perniciously, government handouts is how they're terming it. When
imagine the government doing something for you.
Imagine that.
The government helping you?
People were plenty happy with the $2 trillion bill to give stimulus checks during the COVID pandemic, because that was helping white people as well as other folks, which social support programs all do. But when it is specifically targeted to sort of address historic inequalities that have been created by racism and white supremacy, that's a problem. So with the New Deal, you know, FDR's trying to get this stuff passed. He's trying to get this stuff through Senate. So he's got to make deals. He's got to politicize. He's got to politic, right? And so he makes deals with Southern politicians that basically say, all right, we won't hold this legislation hostage. We'll let you pass it on the stipulation that this government assistance does not go to two classes of people. So this is deep in the Jim Crow era, but they're not using overt racial language. Instead, they say the two classes of people that this New Deal funding is not designed to help are domestic workers and agricultural workers. Isn't that interesting? Because who works as the help or as maids? It's Black women. Who works in the fields as sharecroppers or poor tenant farmers? It's Black people. So they could say, just by including these two groups and saying that, you know, New Deal is not going to help these folks, they would effectively exclude most Black people from that and funnel all of those resources into white communities and white households.
Right. All of this smiling that I'm doing is not because this makes me happy. It's because what else can I do? You know, like it's not happy. I think it's such an important conversation to have. It's an important history for people to understand, because all too often when we don't understand our history, we misassign meaning and blame to people and things in the present day that are being impacted via generations of government policy and social norms. And even if it's not in the law per se, just the way things are done, right? And until we can really examine all of those things and see the impact that they have, we're never going to be able to move forward like we say we want to, like people say they want to, right? Right. So a couple of more questions, and not as much about the book. I mean, they are about the book, but I won't be digging into it because I want people to buy the book and read it. Like, please buy the book and read it. It's very important. One is your thoughts when people say things like, especially when Christians say things like, you know, racism isn't like, it's a heart issue. So it's not, we don't have systemic racism. You know, it's how I feel in my heart. And I don't dislike any Black people. So we're good to go.
Right. Whew.
Yeah.
It's very ahistorical. Like, I mean, this stuff really it just became in much sharper focus as I studied history, because we see it so clearly connected to material issues like wealth, like real estate, like who gets advantages, not just in the New Deal, but like the GI Bill and other programs. Even if we look at recent history, like the PPP loans and loan forgiveness, right? There were white organizations, including white Christian organizations, that got millions upon millions of, loans that they never had to repay, or debt relief or whatever. And that is still concentrated among white people, right? And what is that? How do we explain that? I think Michael Emerson and Christian Smith make a very important point in their book, Divided by Faith. They talk about, how do you describe racism in a post-civil rights era? When all this legislation has been passed to dismantle Jim Crow segregation and explicit forms of racial discrimination, how do you talk about it? Are we post-racial now, as so many would like to believe? Or is racism just an attitudinal thing? And so, it's a heart-to-heart issue and you change it, like Billy Graham said, one heart at a time, one conversion at a time, and then that's going to make people better. And racism is going to go away.
That bullshit. Sorry, excuse me. You're a professional, but that's how I feel about that.
Well, I talk about Graham, and I talk about the evangelical ideas of like a color blind kind of racism, honestly, is what it works out to in the chapter on the civil rights movement. And what Emerson and Smith talk about is a racialized society, a racialized society. And what they explain is that when you look at any important quality of life issues, whether that is maternity death rates, access to health care, wealth accumulation, educational attainment, even life expectancy, all of those fall predictably along racial lines. And that is not a matter of one person saying the N-word. That is a matter of systemic structural issues, the way we have crafted policies to continually funnel resources and hoard resources among one group of people to the detriment and deprivation of all these other groups of people. And it's not enough simply to say, I'm not racist. There's actually two kinds of ways to be racist. You can be actively racist, which is what we think of with people using racial slurs or wearing white robes and hoods or marching in khakis and polo shirts and carrying tiki torches, right?
Nothing tougher.
Yeah. Wow.
That's the master
intimidating
race.
guys. So there's that sort of overt and active racism, but you can also be passively racist. This is the idea of complicity. That, there's that quote, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And that's the idea of complicity. It's not that you're actively doing something harmful. It's that you're not doing anything to prevent it. And that's where a lot of people are, passively racist. What we need to be is actively anti-racist. And to be actively anti-racist is not simply to refrain from using bad language or having personal animosity towards someone. It's to proactively and intentionally change policies. And by the way, I'm not just talking about government political policies. Your company or your workplace has policies. Your school or your college has policies. Even your family has informal kinds of policies and practices that all need to be scrutinized through an anti-racist lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I believe it was you I heard say this on Brad's podcast that I thought was very salient, incredibly pertinent, and something that I've been trying to figure out how to put into words, but hadn't quite found the words. And it was that racism isn't about I'm mean to someone that doesn't look like me anymore, right? Or I'm mean to someone because they don't look like me. Yeah, that's not cool. We shouldn't do that, right? But what actual racism is today is people with privilege who have the power to put that privilege into policy. And
that's right.
I basically just sat down after I heard that, because it was that's what I've been that's the thing that I couldn't quite verbalize. And I don't know if you have any additional thoughts around that, but I just thought that was such an important point for people to understand.
It's a really salient point, especially when people make accusations of reverse racism or anti-white racism. There's a political ad that just came out talking about this anti-white racism. It's a far-right political ad, and they're basically saying the left wants to make all white people bad, and that's racist, and we can't allow that. To which I say, it's not. There's nothing like reverse racism in the sense that we're talking about it here, because racism is not just about personal attitudes. What I say in the first chapter of The Color Compromise, borrowing from social psychologists, racism is a system of advantage based on race. System of advantage based on race has nothing to do with, your personal feelings for or against anyone. It's about a system, right? And the reason about it doesn't exist is because historically and even in the present day, the people who have been historically marginalized are still struggling for equity and power in society, whereas as white people still, by and large, are the ones who have the institutional, political, social power to put their prejudice into policy. So it's not saying that Black people and people of color cannot be racially prejudiced. We can have those feelings of animosity towards someone because of their skin color, right? But the difference is we can't make a law enshrining like they did with race-based segregation, or even much more subtly now with the ways they're doing voter ID laws and making it harder to vote for certain populations, which tend to be poor people and people of color, like they did with the war on drugs and mass incarceration and all of these things. So that's what I'm trying to get at with putting prejudice into policy.
Yes. For anyone that's interested in a bit more detail on that, please read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Sorry to keep plugging other books here. It's such an important conversation, and there's so many good resources out there. And I think your book is so important, and it covers so much ground. And I love it for that. For people that are looking for specific,
absolutely.
I want to know how, about housing policy.
And I would also
more in depth, right? Here's this book or that book.
Definitely read that book. It's sort of foundational. It helps you have a shared language around mass incarceration. But, in shorter bits, I serve on an advisory board for an organization called Equal Justice USA. This is not the Equal Justice Initiative with Brian Stevenson. Check their stuff out too. That's great. But EJUSA is specifically about repealing the death penalty. And we have to look, if we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, the tip of the spear was anti-Black police brutality. It's all these videos of people being brutalized or even killed by law enforcement. But that's just the beginning in terms of the criminal legal system. You also have the crisis of, bail as a way of essentially punishing poor people, which is often a death sentence when we think about COVID spreading in jails and the lack of health care. And then you have issues like the death penalty, which is far and away disproportionately applied to Black people, poor people, and other people of color. So it's one of the major civil rights issues of our day if we're trying to figure out what to do. And Equal Justice USA has a lot of resources there.
Absolutely. Please go check that out. And I'm happy to put all of those links in the show notes for folks. Another book that just popped into my mind for folks that might be interested. It's a bit longer.
Yeah.
Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. Invaluable, especially if this is something that you really want to see the through line throughout history and read about it in pretty substantial detail. Highly recommend that book, but
800 pages.
It's a bit heavier, as in sorry, I feel incredibly rude. Don't forget to buy his book.
If people are looking for next steps, my second book is How to Fight Racism, because the question I always get is what do we do?
Yes.
And this is the practical aspect, and it's based around a framework I call the arc of racial justice, which stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. And if we can have actions in each of those areas, we have a pretty robust racial justice practice. There's also the Young Readers Edition. This is ideal for young people ages 8 and up.
I was going to say.
So, and there's also a podcast mini series, as well as a video teaching series that goes with the Young Readers Edition. And you can go to my Substack to find those resources, and those parts are free.
And you could subscribe to that. Perfect. Yeah, I'm so sorry for recommending all of these books when I'm talking.
No, I've read them all. They're all helpful. We need to
like
have
so
all these angles,
people,
people in different disciplines studying this stuff. If you want to continue the conversation with me, I typically write at jemartisby.substack.com. You can subscribe for free or support the work by being a paid subscriber as well.
Perfect. Well, that's actually an excellent segue, because I do want to let you go, be respectful of the time that I said I would. So my last question, other than having you plug everything at the end, when you are not being a distinguished author, professor, doctor, podcast interviewee,
me and my son, who's 12, we watch a lot of YouTube videos.
Do you remember
Absolutely.
what that word
Listen,
means after
I
school?
think joy and particularly laughter is essential in this work. I'm always fascinated by sort of like behind the scenes stories of civil rights activists. Folks say Martin Luther King Jr. had a wonderful sense of humor. He was a prankster. He loved to laugh. And I absolutely believe that's part of the key to longevity in this racial justice work. We got to laugh. We got to enjoy it. So I try to get outside a lot and just be in fresh air, open air, the sun. I try to laugh a lot. Come on.
Something more you could use.
With this mind, body, spirit, y'all. Let me say,
go outside, touch the grass.
This thing is a holistic, mind, body, spirit endeavor, and we've got to attend to all of it. We cannot. It's a form of white supremacy and oppression for us to neglect self-care, whether that's our bodies or our emotions. So mental health therapy, all of that stuff matters. And if you want to be able to run the marathon and not just the sprint of the next headline or whatever, then we've got to attend to all of these aspects of ourselves. And really, that's part of fulfilling the great commandment. Love the Lord your God with all the heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor, what? As yourself. Boy, you can't love people well if you don't love yourself well, which includes taking care of yourself, even as you fight injustice.
I don't often say amen these days, but amen. I wholeheartedly agree. And I won't speak too much on this because, again, I want to let you go, but I have had several questions recently because I've been talking to more people of faith about how, as I an atheist. In reality, I'm an agnostic, but that's what people have labeled me, so be it. Why? And here's the thing, right? For people that are doing this work, it is so important to build bridges and not just write people off because of their faith beliefs, right? But that doesn't make you any better than, I won't say it, but it's something we've been talking about quite a bit. If you're just writing people off because they believe in something, right? Now, this is what I've always said. I don't have a problem with religion. I have a problem with bigotry, right? And that's across the board. I don't care if you're an atheist or if you're a Christian. My problem is with bigotry. I have lots of friends that are people of faith, and they are doing incredibly important work. And some of it is driven by their faith beliefs. So I love you all very much, so much, but please build more bridges, please. Because in this wave of Christian nationalism that we're seeing, in this rise in anti-Semitism and other forms of racism,
that's right.
We need to build our communities and not create more division just because we don't believe the exact same thing. It doesn't serve any purpose. And I think probably most of my listeners agree with that or understand that, but just in case, I thought that's a good time to throw that out there. You don't have to believe the same thing as someone to do the same very important work.
It's
stop it.
Coalitions and alliances are the only way we're going to save democracy right now. We have got to build bridges, connect, and move forward together in order to have the people power, in order to have the people power to vote in the people and vote on the policies that we need to protect dignity and voting rights and democracy for everyone. So a word well received and well taken.
Sorry, that was definitely not me telling you. I know you know. But it seemed like a fitting
Absolutely.
time to just sort of pop that in for folks, especially because I'm doing this series right now and there's a variety of voices that I'm incredibly privileged to speak with and learn from. And I just sort of wanted to say that. Okay, so I'm going to let you go. But before you go, please tell people where they can find you, how they can best support you. Obviously, the color of compromise, how to be anti-racist. What else? How can people find you?
Sure.
How can
So
they
I'm
show you love? How
still
can they
for
support
now
you?
on Elon Musk's Twitter at Jemar Tisby, but I am more active on Instagram at Jemar Tisby as well. I'm even on TikTok, not on your level, but on there trying to do what the kids do. And of course, my Substack is the best way to follow my work, jemartisby.substack.com.
TikTok is for the youths, and I am not one of them. So someone told me, like, you need to do a trend. And I'm like, what do I look like to you? Like, come on, a trend? My hair is about as much of a trend as you're going to get out of me. On that note, this has been absolutely delightful. Thank you so much for spending time with me and sharing your knowledge and your work with me and my audience. It has
Anytime. Thank you
been
for what you're doing, and
so thank you.
Love talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, friends, like, subscribe. I'm supposed to remind everyone I have a Patreon, so you can sign up for that. And go follow him, buy all of his books, send him cookies, money, I don't know, gifts. Yeah, exactly. And on that note, I'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Oh shit. You done fucked up, man. Ain't nothing but a gangster party. I don't speak no other languages.